Hello and welcome back to this damn fully dualistic crusade. In this video, I wanted to talk about the first of the iconic Doc Savage pulp novels, The Man of Bronze from 1933. For those not familiar with the character, Doc Savage is not only without question the primary influence on Superman, but the case can be made that Doc Savage, while not actually possessing superpowers, is really the first tried and true superhero type character. There had been many precursors, and The Shadow in 1931 had established the hero pulp magazine devoted to a single character in terms of revolutionizing the industry and setting the standard for all of the various characters to come. And Doc Savage was essentially the big follow-up character for Street and Smith, who also published The Shadow. So essentially, they had a 1-2 punch in 1931 and 1933 of the two biggest characters of the pulp era. And since the pulp magazines were the primary influence and were basically copied wholesale and plagiarized for comics, they form the real core of what we know and love and expect from comic books, particularly dealing with superheroes and vigilantes, because all of this stuff, again, comes from the pulp magazine era. So reading the classic characters is like getting to see a completely fresh take on all of these tropes when they were really being established. Again, Doc Savage wasn't doing everything for the first time. There were precursors, of course, but Doc Savage is where it really all comes together. The Shadow, starting in 1931, I think, is where you could really point to as the moment in time where the idea of what we think of in terms of modern superheroes and vigilantes, that's where it really comes to fruition. Before that, you really had the stories of Johnston McCulley, particularly his Zorro tales, really helping to lace up the foundation. But the Shadow is where everything comes together and is the sort of focal point. But Doc Savage is everything that the Shadow isn't. And the idea has always been that the Shadow is to Batman as Doc Savage is to Superman, because the Shadow is the core DNA of the Batman character and is a figure of the night and mysterious and devotes his entire existence to fighting crime, but is himself a mortal man. He has no superpowers. Doc Savage is the antithesis of this. His life is devoted to ending crime and injustice, but he, of course, develops a no-killing rule and uses his great physical strength and incredible technical knowledge, because he's basically an expert in everything. So the usage of gadgetry makes the stories occasionally dip more into science fiction, as the Superman stories do, and all you have to do is read a section of a Doc Savage story, and it just jumps off the page that, I mean, it's pretty much a pulp Superman. And you then see all of the elements lifted directly, as we saw with The Shadow and Batman, of course, that Siegel and Schuster and others would, of course, mine for Superman. Doc Savage is known as the Man of Bronze and is literally named Clark Savage Jr. So right there, just in the name, you've got two of the iconic Superman names in a way. But, of course, Doc Savage has many other Superman connections, most notably his Arctic retreat, the Fortress of Solitude. You can't make this stuff up. It's literally there on the page. But Doc Savage is essentially a self-made man, so he is also an influence on Batman, because Doc Savage is mortal, but he has spent his entire life training for this particular mission. The difference with Doc Savage is that he was essentially born and bred to do this. That this was something that his father instilled in him, this lifelong mission of trying to be the best that is humanly possible in all fields, to essentially be a one-man force against evil and crime in all its forms. That's the thing. Doc Savage isn't just a crime fighter. He is trying to essentially fight an unwinnable fight, a fight that is based around a moral code and a code of ethics. And in terms of the characterization, while the influence on Superman is extreme, and there are frequent moments throughout where basically it's like you're reading a Superman story, but it's not a Kryptonian with powers beyond mortal means. everything else feels very Superman-esque outside of not having actual superpowers. Doc Savage is so skilled, it's almost like he has superpowers. But the actual sort of makeup of the character, there's obviously a great deal of Sherlock Holmes, but there's also elements of Tarzan and other classic precursor characters. So you can see the sort of mixture that went into the character, but the overall appeal and impact of the character is so everlasting that you can't help feel the echoes of everything that's drawn on the character in these stories ever since, most notably Superman. So essentially, if there was a scale with Sherlock Holmes on one end and Superman on the other, right smack in the middle, or to a little bit to either side, you've got Doc Savage. And one cannot overstate how influential these stories are and how many elements have been lifted from and done time and time and time again, over and over, to where they might seem like cliches. But again, all of these various elements, particularly in the field of comics, are pulling from Doc Savage. The influence of the classic pulp characters cannot be stressed enough. But with Doc Savage, you've got entire sections of the comic book landscape that basically start here. And that even includes Doc's aides, the so-called Fabulous Five, that basically follow him on all of his adventures. And they each have their own unique characteristics that set them apart. And they also serve to humanize the Doc Savage character a little bit, provide the comic relief, but also make the stories themselves a bit more relatable, because Doc Savage is such an idealized man. He's basically the most idealized character in, I'd say, all of American literature, really, even more than Superman. It's hard to relate to a character like that. So you do need some of that humanizing of the Fabulous Five, the side characters. And each of them, while it is a little bit confusing at first when you start reading the novels, because it's very easy to sort of blend them all together in your head for the most part, except for the two whose personalities stand out a little bit more, they serve particular functions, and that's an aspect that very much carries over into comics. But also the team dynamic of how everybody interacts. Basically, you have the lead character of Doc Savage front and center always, but the way the five interact and how everyone starts having to basically break into problem solving at every action set piece or a plot they're confronted with is the DNA of most superhero comics. I mean, you read the interactions of all the characters, and particularly the squabbling between the five that occurs, and yeah, it's basically the Fantastic Four and the X-Men and so much of the Marvel universe and so much of the DC universe. You know, you just feel how this is going to echo through decades and decades and decades of comics, but also any sort of action-adventure storytelling. I mean, the influence of these characters and these stories isn't just limited to comics. It becomes something that was infused into pop culture at large. But the actual five helpers or associates or members are associates who actually are friends of Clark Savage Jr. They served together during the First World War, and so they're loyal to the very end and are doing this out of their own personal desires to follow this quest and crusade that was really laid down by Doc's father, Clark Savage Sr., who is actually the sort of impetus for getting the series going here in the first novel. So you've got Rennie Renwick, Long Tom Roberts, Johnny Littlejohn, and then the real two standouts that everybody remembers and loves are, of course, Monk Mayfair and Ham Brooks. And the way the five interact and squabble and try to problem solve are really what humanize the stories and the characters. But also each of the characters has their own particular speciality that they can focus on and are experts in their field. And this is helpful because it allows different subplots to develop further. But if Doc Savage essentially had the time, he could literally do everything because he's just as much an expert, if not an even greater expert in all of these various fields. But it's helpful to have a team of associates, and there's something in the actual splitting up of duties and also working as a team that goes hand in hand with the unbelievable moral code and sense of ethics that Doc Savage not only lives by, but practically defines in all of his actions. So, again, everything really ties into the overall whole. And while the novels are often criticized for having a definite formula to them and a particular style, and the writing not being extraordinarily literary, for lack of a better term, there is a certain strength to having such a core foundation for a long-running series that is, it is definitely reassuring. It's something that you need if you're going to have a series, especially if it's long running, with characters that are firmly set and it's more about the various adventures they go off on. So you need that sort of core, especially in pulp novels, because the writers were naturally going to change up in terms of everybody was using the same pseudonym. And of course, the stories were going to vary depending on the writers or the outlines or the tones desired, or books that were more mysteries versus books that were more out and out action or pure science fiction getting into fantasy. And Doc Savage, in terms of the series, kind of bridges all of those gaps. And of course, Doc Savage was a global character in terms of the adventures would go all over the place and vary wildly, as opposed to characters more like the Shadow that were much more urban oriented and focused expressly on the destruction of crime in all its forms, usually in and around various criminal factions. So it's basically the yin and yang of the classic pulp characters. Everything the Shadow is, Doc Savage isn't. Everything Doc Savage is, the Shadow isn't. But you always need a degree of both to have that particular well-rounded character to the world of in particular, we're talking about the Street and Smith pulp magazine characters. But the allusion to Batman and Superman is so obvious that, again, the Shadow is to Batman what Doc Savage is to Superman. And again, all you have to do is read a couple paragraphs of a Doc Savage story, and it literally screams the Man of Steel, because this is the Man of Bronze. Now, just like the Shadow, most of the Doc Savage novels were actually the creation of one writer, Lester Dent, writing under the pseudonym of Kenneth Robeson. So you basically have somebody not only writing most of the stories, but defining the characters, and again, having that sense of a core unity between all the stories, because you've got one person writing the majority of them. So like the Shadow, mostly being written by Walter P. Gibson, Lester Dent is really the primary series creator because he wrote most of them. And so he is the one that everybody else aspired to in terms of the other Doc Savage novels written by others, and then also all of the pastiches and attempts at continuation books later on. So fascinatingly, you've got a long-running pulp series, or just a long-running series in general, where you have all of these novels pretty much written for the most part by the same person. So there is a consistency of vision, and it must have been helpful that he developed a formula for writing Doc Savage novels, because one can only imagine the sheer amount of work that it was to write novel-length stories for a magazine that was published at a regular interval. Now, the first novel, The Man of Bronze, is a perfect setup, and also, in some ways, it's also giving you the basic origin story. We don't actually see any of this, but every element of Doc Savage's character, the world of the character, his mission, his goal, and the Fabulous Five, all of this is set up in the first book, but it's also a great adventure so the reader doesn't get bored or bogged down in basically telling the origin story. We get pieces of it as the novel goes on, and this is, I think, something that a lot of modern writers could learn from because of the insistence on everybody always telling an origin story over and over again. It's something that will very much bog down a story and get your audience kind of mired in the setup rather than having a great adventure to sort of break that up. So this happens here in the first novel, which tells us the story of Clark Savage Jr., who is essentially thrust into his life of adventure that he's always been prepared for by his father, because his father has been killed by a mysterious disease known as the Red Death, and has left a sort of cryptic message to get his son and his son's friends off on a quest to discover essentially what is a fortune in gold hidden away with a secret tribe of ancient Mayans in the fictionalized country of Hidalgo, which is somewhere in Central America. Doc Savage's offices or home base of operations is actually located on the top or near the top floor. I believe it's the 86th floor of a New York skyscraper, which is pretty much the Empire State Building, so that's already a great visual. And the book is action-oriented from the start, as we get a beautiful flair for the exotic, in that when Doc Savage and his compatriots, the Fabulous Five, are attempting to discover the cryptic note of his father and get the setup of the adventure to go off on, they are attacked by a actual Mayan warrior in New York. But that's not to say that the books themselves are entirely action focused, because even from the start we see there's a great focus on problem solving, on attempting to deal with mysteries, but also a focus on science and factual information and gadgetry, as the message left for Doc Savage has to be decoded essentially by Doc whipping up almost a sort of form of black light to reveal the message actually written in the room that they're in, all the while they're now ducking an assassination attempt and having to use science to work out the exact trajectory of the projectile meant to kill Doc Savage, and then leading to a fantastic action sequence on an unfinished skyscraper under construction. This is a fantastic opening, and again, it is peppered throughout with bits of information that are expository but woven in enough to actually give us the origin and background of the character to get the ball rolling in terms of understanding who Doc Savage is, who are all these other guys following him around, and what is the actual goal of this character, what has his father been essentially training him to do his entire life. Then we get on the adventure to Hidalgo, and this actually, over the course of the story, will explain how Doc Savage gets enough money to carry out this lifelong crusade. It's actually this secret hoard of lost gold hidden away in Hidalgo with the ancient Mayans. Now, in terms of the depiction of the indigenous characters, usually in pulp novels, or frankly, any fiction or writing of this time period in the early 1930s, you're going to run into cultural stereotyping, with, some being obviously worse than others. But fascinatingly, here in this book, you don't really get any of that. All of the Mayan characters, who we spend a great deal of the novel with, because once we leave New York and get to the eventual discovery of the city they're hunting for, the characters are all treated with respect, and some actually have learned English, and Doc Savage and his cohorts actually learn or develop a working knowledge of ancient Mayan, so they actually communicate directly with everyone, and all the characterizations are relatively well-rounded. It's a nice setup, and also a nice change of pace to see something like this, where indigenous characters are treated with a degree of respect in a 1933 pulp novel, because that didn't happen often. And also, you get a recurring theme already here that you find in all the Doc Savage novels written by Lester Dent, of the theme of travel and learning other cultures, because Dent himself was a well-traveled man and also a great sailor and loved just traveling the world and getting the spirit of adventure, and that is perfectly felt and translated into all of his Doc Savage novels. But essentially, Doc and the Five are in this ancient village of surviving Mayans who have been entrusted with guarding the gold treasure discovered originally by Clark Savage Sr., who has, in his death, directed his son to go and not only find this gold, but also prove himself in order to fund the start of his never-ending crusade he's trained his whole life for. But it's not that easy, because Doc Savage also has to deal with the horrible Red Death plague being wielded by a fascinating villain known only as the Feathered Serpent, who may or may not have supernatural abilities. And Doc realizes, of course, that this is the fiend who is behind the death and murder of his father. So not only is this establishing the means of which Doc Savage will be able to carry out his lifelong crusade by obtaining this gold treasure to fund his exploits, but also we get the culmination of the origin story by Doc Savage dealing with the villain who was responsible for the death of his father. So by the end of this novel, everything comes full circle, and we get really the last sort of building blocks to complete this origin story. And we've been able to do this and have a great adventure and establish all these characters without having the baggage of going through the origin story beat for beat for beat and essentially fast tracking through the early life of someone. So it's a great way to approach all of this, to just thrust the reader in, basically halfway through an origin story, and have all the other elements come in, all the building blocks of who these characters are. We learn all about them, and we come to like them through the action and through their reactions through the course of the story. So it's always got a feeling of perpetual movement. And it's very easy to see how this immediately attracted readers in the Great Depression and hooked everyone from the start. Personally, I've read a couple Doc Savage novels, but even though this is the first book, this is actually my favorite one so far. It reads beautifully, and the reader can very easily visualize every bit of action, every bit of the text that you're reading. It's a very visual reading experience, which is very helpful for really engaging with the action and material. But again, I think it's unfair how the Dent's writing has been criticized for having a formula and such. You have to look at the constraints of the form and what the intended product was to create a periodical magazine of novels to basically provide the ultimate escapism to audiences of the Great Depression. And these really do that like nothing else, which is part of their everlasting influence on practically everything that's come since. But it's fascinating to see how much of the core elements and how much the characters are already drawn in this first novel. There are further things that will be refined and tweaked a little bit in later books. There is more of a propensity for gunfights and killing in the first couple books, but nothing that's too over the top or bloodthirsty. But again, it will develop more into Doc's code of non-killing when and where possible, and of course eventually his attempts to reform criminals instead of simply eliminating them. But you can tell that's probably one of the elements that's going to get further refined over time. Again, you can tell this is an early book, let alone the first book, but so much of everything else is already there that it's mostly fully formed. We even have Doc as a rather chaste character who doesn't really have time for relationships, but doesn't completely shut people down or discourage them. There's a continual amusing subplot with the princess of the Mayans, who is, of course, taken with this, quite frankly, bronze god of a man who's seemingly perfect in all ways and able to do everything, but he doesn't really have time for that, let alone doesn't quite know what to do with the constant affections of someone else. And it's probably the one area that Doc Savage does not have a great expertise in and is not perfect at. So it's a bit amusing, that sort of dynamic, and this is something that will occasionally crop up in the later books. So it's nice to see that even that part of the character is already here and that the author has a little fun with that. And again, I have to mention how it's fascinating that the indigenous characters are treated with a degree of respect, and there's not heavy caricaturing of them or their dialogue. Everything is believable in terms of the actual setup and how our characters get to the sort of hidden city, and also how they have to live with the people and prove themselves while trying to defeat the villain that emerges. And the actual threat of the Red Death virus or plague is quite substantial, because there's great descriptions given to how deadly it is and how much people suffer with it, but also great detail has gone into how Doc Savage and his friends try to use scientific means and medical techniques to fight back against this plague when and where possible. So everything is actually done in a relatively believable manner, which grounds the story and makes us more interested in what happens to these characters and where this series is going to go. Now, I read this in the beautiful Sanctum Books reprint, which has 2 novels per each of their volumes. Sometimes they had more, 3 or 4 novels per volume. But these are beautiful reproductions. They do reproduce the original artwork, which here for the Man of Bronze is absolutely stunning and perfectly depicts Doc Savage in a moment of potential peril and has the iconic ripped shirt. Basically, anytime Doc Savage puts on a shirt, it's going to get ripped somehow. Basically, Superman has his costume and cape. Doc Savage has his ripped shirt and overall bronzed appearance that he's always described as having. Basically, the ripped shirt is Doc Savage's costume, if he had one, because no matter what, it always gets ripped, and all of the covers depict him with the iconic ripped shirt. Of course, there's also the incredible James Bama artwork for the 1960s paperback series. These are absolutely stunning works of art, and really, I think the major impetus for why the character had a resurgence of popularity in the 60s, as everybody would just buy these covers because they were drawn in by Bama's incredible paintings, which really go for the bronzed Superman that is described in the text, but it's much more fantastic than the more grounded Doc that we see on the pulp covers. So basically, I think the pulp magazine cover version of Doc is really what I picture when I read the stories, and what it would look like in real life in terms of what this guy would look like. But the way the text describes it at times, that's where Bama got his inspiration from for his incredible paintings. So you kind of have to pick and choose between which cover you prefer. And some of the Sanctum volumes were made available with the Bama cover artwork. So that's why the paperbacks from the 60s are so collectible, is that they have the incredible art. So essentially those paintings are to Doc Savage what Frank Frazetta's incredible paintings are to Conan the Barbarian. They're just as iconic and important, and all of this stuff belongs in a museum. Now, the Sanctum reprint is actually reprinting the first 2 novels, which is great, so you can read them chronologically, as I'm trying to do. The only issue is that Sanctum did not do their Doc Savage and Shadow volumes in chronological order, so this is actually volume 14. And quite frequently they would be, kind of completely random novels stitched together, or with a central theme, or something that unified them, but they weren't actually in chronological order. Now, you can read the pulp novels out of order and not really miss anything, because they were designed mostly to be standalone stories outside of particular story arcs. But I myself prefer reading them in chronological order, because you can see how the stories grew, how the writers grew, how things developed, and you get into that sort of feeling of the chronology. So I can understand why they went for this particular approach, but it does make it difficult if you're collecting these and you're trying to read the stories in order. You do have to keep in mind you have to mix and match between volumes. This is just a particular case where we got lucky and one volume has the first 2 stories. The other thing about the Sanctum reprints is, unfortunately, they're all out of print. Condé Nast, who owns all of the Street Smith characters, pulled the license, and so these have gotten incredibly rare, and I, like others, have been buying any volumes I can find. So this is just going to be an intermittent series as I try to get all the Sanctum volumes and then read and review all of the Doc Savage and Shadow stories in chronological order, because I didn't have enough work to do. What's always fantastic about the Sanctum volumes is not only are they beautifully done, but they also have fantastic supplements that tell you more about the world of not just the stories and the characters, but the people behind them, particularly writer Lester Dent and the men at Street and Smith behind the pulp magazine. So you get such a sense of the actual world of how these stories were originally created and the market they were created for. So this particular volume has a wonderful foreword by Lester Dent himself before launching into The Man of Bronze. This has a beautiful resetting of the original text, but replicates the original dual column format of the pulp novel. But we have a beautiful replication of all the interior original artwork beautifully laid out throughout the entirety of the story. This includes all the bits of additional text and smaller illustrations. So for me, Sanctum is really the gold standard for doing all of this in terms of reprinting pulp novels, but doing it with the greatest of respect and trying to ensure that every last element is about as perfected as it can be. And it's befitting that this was all the product primarily of Anthony Tollin, who was the guy who was running Sanctum Books, who had an entire career in comics, but was also a devoted fan and historian for pulp magazines and Golden Age radio, and got to meet and interact with a lot of these legends from the pulp era. So this entire venture was really a labor of love in trying to preserve the classic pulp characters. This illustration is something that evildoers never want to see. A very unhappy Doc Savage just coming into the room, and you know that everyone in said room is about to be completely thwarted or unconscious within seconds. And then a similar scene with various warriors from different factions. And then in between the two novels, Sanctum will include a historical essay, usually by Will Murray, as he did here. And this is an excellent essay about the origins and development of the character, basically giving you a crash course in how Doc Savage was born. And this gives you all the important context you need for how the character was developed, but also what caused the everlasting impact of the character. Then we go into the second novel, The Land of Terror, which I'll cover in another video, and then the book concludes with a nice actual printing of Lester Dent writing a short autobiography. So that's fun, hearing the author talk about himself in his own words. So again, this is a beautifully reproduced volume, and nicely, this is one of the volumes that has not only the first two books, but they're in chronological order. And it's important reading the early stories to kind of have them together, because you can see there were elements that would grow and develop or get tweaked a little bit as the series ran on. So that's why I think it's important to read the books in chronological order if possible. But again, you can kind of pick and choose. You don't have to read them in chronological order. So this is still relatively available. Usually the earlier Sanctum volumes, this being 14 would be one of them, usually the earlier numbered volumes are a little bit more available, but they are drying up more and more on the used market, and values are going up like crazy. Unfortunately, Condé Nast has not allowed anyone or announced any plans to ever reprint the novels again, so it's entirely fans having to track down the Sanctum volumes or vintage paperbacks, or of course the original pulps themselves, which are very expensive and difficult to come by. That's how you read the stories, but the Sanctum volumes are the best iteration at present, and they were able to complete the whole series. So if you're able to collect all of these Sanctum volumes, you can actually read the entirety of the Doc Savage canon. I'm working my way there, but I'm nowhere near complete. But at least volume 14 is the first two novels, and you can actually still manage to find this at a decent price. So those are my thoughts on the first Doc Savage novel, The Man of Bronze, and the Sanctum Books volume 14 reprint that brings together the first two Doc Savage novels by Lester Dent. This is, without question, one of the building blocks of not only comic books, but really American pop culture in general and adventure fiction. Doc Savage is one of the most important characters and creations of the 20th century. It is just reading a section of any of Lester Dent's Doc Savage novels is seeing so many ideas and characters and tropes and plot elements and things that would become so ingrained in pop culture and storytelling that they themselves might be seen as cliches. But I mean, there's such a freshness to these. There's such an everlasting appeal that they never date and they never get old, which is why I think people were able to pick up the 1960s paperbacks with the amazing artwork and just immediately become enthralled. And so the character was introduced to an entirely new generation, and it didn't matter that they were books from the 30s and 40s. So again, these books are timeless. They are absolute landmark classics, even though they're not looked upon for literary significance. They themselves earn that by being so iconic and so well done for what they're aiming for. And again, the influence is just absolutely staggering. Basically, what elements are not drawn from the Shadow stories for comics, those were from Doc Savage. I mean, everything that's in these books, even just reading this first book, you just see so much of what you know and love and come to expect from a good comic book, because it's all here. And most of all, the connections to Superman are just endless. They are endless. I mean, the fact that the Fabulous Five at the start of the novel have to wait to get in touch with Doc Savage because he's too busy having to muse over his thoughts and brood a little bit and focus himself in his fortress of solitude. I mean, it's just that's how we're introduced to Doc Savage. They have to wait for him to come back from the fortress of solitude. So, and of course, that's the name, and he is the Man of Bronze. It just screams Superman throughout. It is absolutely unmistakable, but there's such a purity in the character that you can understand why Siegel and Schuster were so influenced and why so much of Doc Savage rubbed off on Superman in the way that the Shadow rubbed off so much on Batman. And while both Superman and Batman started as very direct derivatives of the pulp characters, they grew over time and developed through all the various writers and creators. But at their core, they still are rooted, when done properly, in the classic pulp landscape and the pulp characters that they drew so heavily from. So if you've always been a fan of what people term the big blue Boy Scout and how Superman has such a moral code and a code of ethics and is devoted to overall general goodness, that all comes from Doc Savage. So if that's something that's always appealed to you in Superman's core DNA, well, you have to read the Doc Savage novels because that's where it all comes from. So for me, finally reading Doc Savage #1, it's seeing the start of all this, and the book itself is so well written and so engaging that I do think it is one of the great first appearances of a classic iconic character. It is one of the all-time great debuts. In and of itself, it's a great novel. And for all the criticism you'll see about there being a Doc Savage formula and Lester Dent not being a very literary writer and being very workmanlike in his prose, this is a great novel. This achieves everything that it sets out to do, and it starts one of the greatest series in all of American fiction. That is also one of the most influential pieces of American fiction ever written. I mean, Doc Savage and the Shadow alone are arguably two of the most influential characters in all of fiction ever, just looking at the amount of material that they either influenced or helped to create, or the material that completely plagiarized them or lifted elements wholesale and then put a different name on it. So they're so ingrained in our overall pop culture and American storytelling that their influence is inescapable. But going back to the source and reading Doc Savage #1, The Man of Bronze, is a magical experience. It is a truly great novel, not just a great pulp novel, not just a great one of the great debuts of all time, but it's a great book experience in its own right and should be read and enjoyed by everyone. This is a book I think everyone should read. And if you can find the Sanctum volume, that's the best way to experience it. But again, you can pick up one of the beautiful vintage paperbacks with the incredible James Bama artwork. So this is just the start of an ongoing series I'd like to do of reading all of the Doc Savage novels I can get my hands on, hopefully being able to go in chronological order through the Sanctum volumes that I've been able to pick up, and hopefully I can finish the series someday if I can find all the other Sanctum books, but unfortunately they have really become rather scarce on the used market. So getting into this may be a little bit difficult and be a little bit pricey if you collect the Sanctum volumes or vintage paperbacks, or especially the original pulp magazines, but it is very much worth your time to experience one of the all-time great and most influential hero characters in the original form of Lester Dent's incredible pulp novels. So, as always, I hope my babbles about classic pulp characters, heroes, and adventure stories has been at least somewhat fun and informative. While it's a shame that Sanctum Books is no longer around, one hopes that someday Condé Nast will allow others to get the license to get the stories back into print and available again. If more people knew about these classic stories, their influence, and how magical they are, there would be a greater following. It just requires a big enough effort in terms of promoting them and getting behind these classic stories to get them back into the popular consciousness. And maybe someday we might be able to see something as that makes it as much of a splash as the 1960s paperbacks did. As always, please do keep supporting your local independent bookstores and comic shops by hopefully being able to pick up some pulp reprints. Please do support all the wonderful publishers and people who reprint the classic pulp stories that are still around. And definitely keep reading, keep enjoying classic pulp stories. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.